The governor didn't blink and pulled out the veto pen. Florida's lawmakers will have to go back to work in Tallahassee after the chief executive rejected new congressional maps. Today, we're looking at the details and the quirky nature of the battle lines being drawn among members of the same political party. Speaking of battles, what's the connection between Russia's aggression in Ukraine and China?
We should never buy a product from Russia, buy a product from Iran, buy a product from communist China. Never, never, never. Our companies should not be doing business there.
Senator Rick Scott explains his mission to decouple from the world's most populated nation in order to protect America's national security. Those topics and Hand on Government on This Week in Jacksonville. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're looking at a special legislative session coming up. Florida lawmakers are going to have to go back to the literal drawing board, apparently. Government law attorney Chris Hand joining us today for our regular segment, Hand on Government. And Chris, your experience there, you worked for a Florida governor, Bob Graham, and we saw the state's current governor use the power of the veto pen on these congressional redistricting maps. They were submitted and approved by the legislature. So help us understand, why can the state executive branch make this move when it affects the federal seats for U.S. representatives?
Well, first, Kent, it's an almost unprecedented move to have the governor veto the congressional map that the legislature drew, even though he or she has the right to do that. But the way it works is states are responsible for drawing districts, whether those are legislative districts like state Senate and state House districts, or those are congressional districts to decide who's going to represent us at the U.S. House of Representatives. Well, under Florida law, legislators can pass their own maps subject to Supreme Court review, and the governor doesn't have anything to do with that. But also under that law, the governor has the right to veto the congressional maps. Hadn't been exercised by a lot of governors before Governor DeSantis did it this past week, but now he has. And as we've said, legislators will be coming back to Tallahassee for a special session the week of April the 18th to see if they can draw maps that they and the governor can now agree on.
So this seems a little weird. Republican governor, Republican majority and control in the House, same in the Senate, and they can't agree on this? Why?
Well, Ken, it's not always about parties. Sometimes it's about priorities. It seemed clear during the legislative session that the legislature's priority, the priority of the Senate president and the House Speaker, was to get the maps done and minimize the chances that they might be subject to a long legal process. In other words, we've seen in past years that people have challenged these maps in court. That can take quite a bit of time, be very expensive, and creates uncertainty in the process. So the legislature's priority, it seemed this year, was to pass maps that were less likely to attract that sort of litigation. The governor had a different priority, a couple of priorities. One, wanted to make a statement apparently throughout the process about the Voting Rights Act and the 14th Amendment. The governor has a legal theory on that that he talked about in his veto message, and doesn't think the maps are constitutional, and apparently wants to test that. Also, there's some speculation that the governor's work on this was really designed to appeal to his particular political base. So there was a clash as a result. Even though they were members of the same party, there were different priorities as it came to redistricting.
Many of you, I think, will probably understand this, but if you haven't heard about this, one of the sticking points is the 5th Congressional District. It's currently represented by Congressman Al Lawson. It stretches from Jacksonville to Tallahassee and connects predominantly black communities here. The state legislature passed a bill that actually included 2 different maps, one that drew a new 5th district entirely. It's within Duval County. And then there was a backup map that was kind of similar to the current districts. Let me show you this. Governor DeSantis rejected both those proposed maps. He wants it significantly redrawn, previously put out his own congressional map. Governor DeSantis saying that he doesn't want the courts in charge of drawing the map. So, Chris, why is the clock ticking here? And from my view, well, candidates have to know which voters they're going to speak to in a campaign, and the campaigns are coming up, qualifying in June, primary elections August, general election November, but all of that will be here very soon.
Well, Kent, you're exactly right. We're now in the very surreal situation that you have congressional candidates running around the state, campaigning, raising money for districts they have no idea what they're going to look like when this process is over. So it's very challenging in that scenario. As you say, we're kind of running out of time in this process. The qualifying period for congressional candidates starts in the middle of June. The Florida Department of State can start accepting qualifying materials next month on May the 30th. So we really are at a time crunch. That legislative session is that special session is going to be key to figuring it out. But you can count on there being litigation following whatever the legislature does there. There are already lawsuits filed in state court and federal court to address the congressional redistricting issue. Look for those lawsuits to either take on new subject matter or for new lawsuits to be filed. At some point, the courts are probably going to have to weigh in on this process.
Chris, I want to lean into your experience here in the city of Jacksonville, working at City Hall as you did. Always seems to be a plan or a proposal for developing in downtown. Well, this week we actually saw action. The USS Orleck arrived a week ago. It's a warship museum. It's going to be on display at the shipyards. More than a decade of effort by a Jacksonville group just to get a ship here. First, they targeted the USS Charles F. Adams, eventually the Orleck, which you're seeing here. Also, we saw a very slow process, the move of the Fire Museum from Metro Park. Chris, what do you make of these changes, and what do you think it really does to the area of downtown we're talking about, this museum district?
Well, Ken, first of all, congratulations to local attorney Dan Bean and the Jacksonville Historic Naval Ship Association. They have been working on this for a long time. Back when I was in City Hall in the early part of the last decade, this was a priority they've been working on. So congratulations to them on that perseverance and persistence. And I know they and a variety of members of this community were very excited to see that ship come up the St. Johns River when it did. You know, museums and cultural attractions, Kent, are a key part of what makes downtowns and center cities vibrant. And I think one of the things the city is attempting to do here is kind of create some synergy among museums. So you'll have the USS Orleck, the Naval Ship Museum, you'll have the Fire Museum. Of course, the Museum of Science and History is scheduled to move across the river and also be in that same general area. But again, I suspect it's all part of an effort to kind of help enhance the vibrancy of downtown. You think about what museums and other cultural attractions add to our community, whether that's the Cummer Museum and Gardens, or whether that's the Museum of Contemporary Art, or the Museum of Science and History in its current location. And there are other Florida cities, Kent, that have really utilized museums and cultural attractions to help power their downtown revitalization. A great example is the city of St. Petersburg, much like Jacksonville, a town that's surrounded by water, but through the Dali Museum and other museums they have there, have really managed to attract people downtown and from across the state and even around the world to take advantage of those attractions. So I think that's probably part of the strategy here. It's one that's worked in other communities, and will be interesting to see how that museum synergy takes place in future years.
Yeah, a lot of people have leaned in over the last several years. Hey, all we're doing is blowing things up. Let's create something. So seeing that action this week, I know, was encouraging to a lot of people. Chris, by the way, is staying with us for our whole show today. Coming up, we are also hearing from Senator Rick Scott. That's when we come back. Stay with us here on This Week in Jacksonville.
You're watching This Week in Jacksonville with Kent Justice.
Lots going on in the country and internationally, as well as here in Florida and Jacksonville. Now, I spoke this week with U.S. Senator Rick Scott. The former governor of Florida explained his view on the proposed White House budget, Ukraine, and investments in Russian companies. We started by discussing a roundtable he hosted on threats from communist China.
American companies, our government has been able to sanction Russia because we're not very dependent on them. Maybe people would like to have their Russian vodka, but other than that, we're not generally very dependent on them. Think of the difference with communist China. They're threatening to invade their neighbor. They're threatening to invade Taiwan. And American companies are dependent on Chinese companies. And so we have to stop and say to ourselves, does that make any sense? Why would we be dependent on somebody that has elected to be our adversary? The government of Communist China has elected to be our adversary. Think about what they do. They steal our jobs. They steal our technology. They're building a military with the goal to be able to defeat us. They want to invade our ally, Taiwan. They put about 1 million people in a prison, or more than 1 million, for their religion. They took away the basic rights of the Hong Kong citizens. They're flying sorties over Taiwan. They're stealing organs from prisoners and selling them on the black market. So it didn't sound like it's some place where we ought to be doing business. So my goal yesterday was, make sure we're having a conversation about this. How do we make sure we don't continue to be dependent on communist China? One individual there just lost his mother, who was a Falun Gong supporter, and she was arrested, put in prison, tortured, and she just recently died in the last 2 weeks as a result of torture for simply believing in something different than the communist Chinese government. I mean, they go out and they harass Christians and Tibetans and Uyghurs and Falun Gong practitioners. It's disgusting.
Senator, one of the connections that I hear made is between, hey, what Russia's doing in Ukraine, China's watching. When it comes to what Russia is doing in Ukraine, and this week there have been talks of maybe scaling back. I don't know that the U.S. military and intelligence really believes that's what Russia is doing. But there's also talk about, hey, federal, national sanctions on Russia. Can states be doing more? And when we looked into this, we see that Florida, the retirement system, has more than $300 million invested in Russian companies. Is that something that states like Florida should be getting out of, selling those investments in Russia to try and support Ukraine?
Absolutely. I think we have to look at ourselves and say, whether it's Russia or communist China, our pension plans shouldn't be investing there. We shouldn't be buying products from there. We should never buy a product from Russia, buy a product from Iran, buy a product from communist China. Never, never, never. Our companies should not be doing business there. Think about what's going to happen to our companies. If you did business in Russia right now, you're expected to shut down your operations. Now, if that was true, if communist China invades Taiwan, think about the American companies that have big investments in communist China. Are they going to shut down their operations? We as Americans are going to expect them to if they're going to invade our allies. So whether it's our pension plans, us as individuals, or companies, we've got to start saying to ourselves, we've got to decouple. We can't be doing business in Russia. They basically want to defeat us. Communist China wants to defeat us. I'm very appreciative that the Ukraine citizens have stood up for democracy, because think about what we're doing right now. We need to give them every resource we can, because if they can't defeat Russia, then where's Russia stop? Do they go into Poland next? If they go into Poland, then American men and women will be fighting Russian forces because we're a member of NATO.
One of the things I saw in the recent White House budget proposal for the next fiscal year is more investment to try and help Ukraine. Certainly, there's a big investment in military in that budget. How do you feel about this budget from President Biden? Because one of the things they were touting is, hey, we want to try and reduce our national debt.
Well, if that's what he tried, he sure failed. Stop and think about this for a second. We've had, over the last 20 years, about a 16% increase in our population, right? What do you think our federal budget has gone up by? Over 300%. We've seen basically no population growth in the last 12 months, 0.1% of 1%. And this budget takes it up by 7.4%. Now, there's clearly things we should invest in. We have to invest in a stronger military. Well, under Biden's plan, he doesn't even stay up with inflation. But he invests extra dollars in things that actually, some of them make people more dependent on government when we know our government is not living within its means. That doesn't make any sense. So I want to continue to help Ukraine. I want to continue to make sure we have the most lethal military in the world so we can defend our freedoms. But we've got to watch our money. We've got to live within our means. His budget doesn't do anything to make sure Social Security is going to continue to be funded. Doesn't do anything to make sure Medicare is going to be funded. And we know the projections. Both of those go bankrupt in the next few years. So this is not a serious budget. This is not a budget that's good for American families. It's not going to put us in a position of fiscal responsibility. And it's fascinating when he says he wants to pay down the deficit. He increases over the next 10 years our debt by $15 trillion, almost $15 trillion. $15 trillion. I mean, this is staggering, these numbers.
So, Chris Hand, you recently wrote about the opportunity for people in Florida or the state of Florida to support Ukraine. And you heard me, I asked Senator Scott about that. He agrees Florida should get out of those Russian investments. But it doesn't sound like the state's going to do that based on what we saw at the cabinet meeting this last week.
Well, Ken, that's a question a lot of people are asking. How can I, as an individual, help Ukraine? And one is to encourage state and local governments to take action. Now, a lot of people think, well, hang on, that's the federal government. They handle foreign policy. Remember, states and localities invest a lot of money through pension plans. They do business and provide contracts to companies, and in the past have had actually a significant role in shaping the course of global events as a result in places like South Africa and Northern Ireland. Well, Ukraine is another example, and right after the Russian invasion occurred, occurred, a variety of states swung into action in a very bipartisan way. The two newest governors in the country, Kathy Hochul in New York State and Glenn Youngkin in Virginia, were both very active in encouraging their states' retirement systems to divest of any Russian assets and to stop doing business with any companies. And you've seen a variety of other states, from Texas to Colorado to Maryland to North Dakota, take on similar approaches to try and divest from Russia. Well, one state that hasn't done it yet is Florida. There was an opportunity in the legislative session this year to try and do that. It didn't occur, and the Florida cabinet has now passed on that as well, which is very different from many states around the country which have taken action. To this point, Florida still has its $300 million invested in Russian-based investments.
So we are going to continue talking. Chris is staying with us. And, you know, we know state lawmakers are going to have to go back to Tallahassee. We just talked about that in our previous segment, but they finished the budget. We're going to look at the federal budget proposal from the White House, some of what Senator Scott was talking about. That's next on This Week in Jacksonville.
You're watching This Week in Jacksonville on Channel 4.
And Chris Hand is with us today, government law attorney here in Jacksonville. Chris, state lawmakers passed a budget as they're supposed to, but it's going to get a good workout from the governor's, at least the potential of his veto pen here in line item vetoes. The White House announced its proposed budget as well. It seems like a different process, or maybe I don't understand. The White House proposing their budget, and already senators like Mr. Scott and other people are weighing in on what they think are priorities, good policy, bad policy.
Well, there are some big differences between the state and the federal process, and one is timing. You know, a governor proposes his budget basically at the beginning of a legislative session or shortly before that. The legislature then has 60 days, the time of the session, to pass a budget, and doesn't have much time beyond that because the state's fiscal year starts on July 1st each year. And then when a final budget is transmitted to the governor, he or she has line item veto authority. It can actually strike through individual appropriation items in that budget and say, nope, that's not going to be in the budget this year. It is a little bit different process in the federal government. President proposes a budget. It goes to the House and Senate Appropriations Committee, but that can take a long time. Just to give you an example, the federal fiscal year started on October 1, 2021, but it wasn't until mid-March of 2022 that Congress actually passed a budget. Between that time, it was relying on what people are known as continuing resolutions or stopgap spending bills. And then when a budget finally does go to the president, unlike a governor, the president doesn't have line item veto authority. So he or she can either sign the budget or veto the budget, but cannot get rid of individual line items.
Significant difference,
Big difference,
as you point out there. You know, one of the things that is the mandate of the legislative session, you got to have a budget. In this case, we already talked earlier about they've got to go back and redo congressional district maps. One of the things that happened a year ago was some election law reform, and I bring this up because we're seeing that this week a court ruled on this. Maybe explain what happened there and how this affects future legislative measures that the state of Florida might take on election law.
Well, Ken, it might be helpful to go back actually 2 years to the 2020 election, which for the most part in Florida was considered to be a well-run, reasonably problem-free election. A couple of problems here in Duval County, but for the most part around the state, it was considered a fairly problem-free election.
Especially in comparison to 20 years earlier.
Correct,
right? You know,
right.
Big difference.
You know, the very big difference. So in relative terms, very problem-free. But so some people were surprised in 2021 that, you know, the old rule, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, that the legislature came in and actually made some pretty significant changes to the election law, including how many drop boxes that election supervisors can use and where and what time, some new restrictions on registering people to vote. Those changes were very controversial when they passed in 2021 and became the subject of a lawsuit. Well, just a couple of days ago, the U.S. District Court in Tallahassee, Judge Mark Walker, issued a ruling invalidating portions of that law, particularly as it relates to drop boxes and voter registration, and took one step further. He said that he detected a pattern over the last 20 years of the legislature disproportionately burdening minority voters here in the state, and has now required that before the state passes any other election law changes, that it obtain what's called pre-clearance from the federal courts. In other words, if you want to pass changes, you got to go to the federal court first and say, can we pass pass those changes, or are they in violation of your ruling here? It's a ruling that's long. It's almost 300 pages long, and it's almost certainly going to be appealed to the 11th Circuit at this point. But major ruling regarding election law that has invalidated some of what the legislature did in 2021.
One of the things that the judge said that I'm just going to read here, based on the indisputable pattern set out above, this court finds that in the past 20 years, Florida has repeatedly sought to make voting tougher for black voters because of their propensity to favor Democratic candidates. It's a pretty serious charge, if you will. And I know the judge isn't about making charges, but
sure,
that claim.
Well, that'll probably be part of what's appealed, and that decision, that finding on his part, was what led him to impose the pre-clearance requirements, where the legislature has to go back to federal court before it passes more changes. That's certainly going to be a portion of this ruling that's going to be appealed. So probably more to come in the 11th Circuit, but a major election law ruling just in time for the 2022 elections.
Yeah, would it necessarily affect how these elections happen this summer?
Yes, no, I think it would absolutely have an impact on 2022. Now, of course, depending on what happens at the appeals court and elsewhere in the process, but it could certainly have an impact in 2022.
Yeah, a lot happening in just the last week here. Chris Hand, our Hand on Government segment happens once a month, and I appreciate your insights from your experience. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Ken.
All right, so ahead in the month of April, future Speaker of the Florida House, Paul Renner, plans to be here in studio. We're also in touch with Green Beret and U.S. Representative Michael Waltz about an appearance here. Lots to talk about with him. This Week in Jacksonville airs each Sunday morning at this time. I'm Kent Justice. Thanks for watching on air on Channel 4. You can also find us at noon on Sundays on the CW17. And we're online at news4jax.com or streaming on News4Jax Plus.
See why every day more people are choosing News 4 Jax, Northeast Florida and South Georgia's #1 source for local news.